Hello, welcome. We are on day 51 of the Bible tour and we are having a second day looking at Mark's Gospel. I hope yesterday I managed to enthuse and excite you about Mark's Gospel and about what it says about Jesus. I know I enthused and excited myself, or at least Mark did it for me, I think. So we looked yesterday at the great theme of who is Jesus. And Mark's other great theme, although he obviously has many things he wants to say, but another of his great themes is, okay, how do you respond? Because it's not enough simply to know who this Jesus is. You need to be guided about how to respond to who this Jesus is. One commentator, Donald English, says this, to the question, how do people in Mark's Gospel show faith in Jesus? The answer, to put it bluntly, is that mostly they don't, which is really a nice way of putting it and quite true. So in Mark's Gospel, his own family don't believe him and try on at least one occasion to kind of thwart his purpose. Not spitefully or vindictively, but because they just don't get it. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus' own townspeople don't get it. They don't understand or appreciate him. In Mark's Gospel, the religious leaders don't get it. They are kind of cool to begin with, and then later on, of course, they actively plot for his death. In Mark's Gospel, the crowd doesn't get it. The crowd has been described as a character in its own right in Mark's Gospel. He talks quite a lot about the crowd. And although they kind of follow and they enjoy the teaching and they're kind of wowed by his miracles, but in the end they do nothing to save him. And if the crowd is a character, and obviously in real terms I understand that crowds change in their constituency, as it were, but if the crowd is a character in Mark's Gospel, then the crowd is a character that initially follows and then falls away. And even his disciples, and maybe even particularly his disciples, just don't really get it. And as I mentioned yesterday, Peter is a very good example of this. He struggles to understand. He doesn't really understand. And even when he gets these glorious glimpses, so we spoke yesterday about his wonderful moment in Mark, I think it's 8, isn't it? Where he suddenly says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus kind of says, "Well done," yes, basically. And then Jesus starts talking about how he has to suffer, and then immediately Peter starts goofing again. He goes, "Oh no, 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 Lord, this will never happen to you." So even this moment, he gets it wrong immediately afterwards, which gives hope to many of us with size 14 feet, of whom I am definitely one. Where am I? Yes, with regard to that, I wanted to just point out one thing which may explain something that's puzzled you, or which try to explain something that may have puzzled you, and also is part of this theme. So in 8:22, we have a puzzling little miracle. Mark 8:22, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man and led him out of the village. And he laid his hands on him and he said, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he says, "Oh, I see men, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now this is, can feel quite puzzling. Did Jesus have to have two goes? Did something go wrong at this point? But if we look at the positioning, and this is my one of my top tips for how to read the Gospels, is look at where the bit you are looking, the pericope you're looking at, look at where it fits in the connection with what's before it and after it. And that will often give us a really helpful clue. So if we look at what comes before and after that pericope, immediately before, they've had this conversation where, quite honestly, the disciples have once again just not got it. And he says to them twice. He says in verse 17, "Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember?" And then verse 21, do you still not understand? So that's what comes before. And then afterwards, we get this moment when Peter makes this confession of faith, and it's like, oh, I do get it. And so what I think we are seeing here is we are seeing the gradual dawning understanding of the disciples. And from do you still not get it to Peter, at least momentarily, getting it, in the middle we have this little miracle story which acts as a kind of parable. I'm not saying a parable as in it's made up, but it acts as a parable in terms of explaining and highlighting really the dawning understanding of the disciples. And I think that's what this stepwise healing of the man's sight is meant to highlight to us. There are two groups that do get who Jesus is in the gospel. The first one, ironically, is the demoniacs, the people who have demons inside of them. However, we might want to understand that in modern terms. In the ancient mind, for sure, it's understood as being demon possession. And in the demons get it. The demons know who Jesus is. So chapter 1, verse 24, for example. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. That's a demon saying it. And 5 verse 7, something similar. Let me just read you that. Crying out with a loud voice, this possessed man said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" So demons get who Jesus is instantly, and of course they resist him. But nonetheless, as far as the gospel writer is concerned, this is a very useful way of showing us who Jesus is early on before other people do get it. And the other group that gets it are the desperate, the people who are dying and sick and bereaved and blind and so on. They get it, and these are the people who have nowhere else to turn to. So that's the other big theme, if you like, is so the first theme is who is Jesus, and the second one is do you get who Jesus is? Do you understand who Jesus is? It's kind of Mark's challenge to his readers, I think. Now, in the second half of the video this morning, I'm going to drill down on 2 or maybe 3, depending on how time goes, passages that I'd just like to talk about in a little bit more detail. Again, 1 or 2 things that you may not have spotted before. The first thing I want to show you is in Mark 11, and it's the cursing of the fig tree, which is another bit that I think is often misunderstood. So if you are, if you've forgotten it or you're unfamiliar with it, Mark 11 verse 12, Jesus sees a fig tree and he walks up to it and looks for figs because he thinks there's figs on it, and there are no figs on the tree. And so he curses it and he says, "May you never bear fruit again." And people read this as Jesus just lost it. He was hungry, perhaps he was hangry, to use that new word. But he kind of flips out and he misuses his power against this hapless tree. Now, I don't think this is at all what is happening. And I think once again, we need to understand this as an acted parable, just like what I was saying a minute ago about that 2-step healing of the blind man. Now, when we looked at the prophets, particularly Ezekiel, but some of the others as well, we spoke about prophetic actions, about things that actions that demonstrated the word of God rather than simply words that spoke the word of God. And Jesus does prophetic action a lot, actually. I think maybe the healing of the blind man was what I just referred to as a prophetic action. Getting on a donkey and riding into Jerusalem is a prophetic action. Taking bread and breaking it and wine and sharing it is a prophetic action. Enacted parables, if you like. And this is another one. And the clue we have, again, is the way this is placed in the gospel. So the first thing to notice is we've just had the triumphal entry, okay? And in verse 11, so Jesus has just come into Jerusalem on the donkey, great big palm trees, crowd celebrating and everything. And he goes into Jerusalem and he goes into the temple and he has a little look around. And then he goes home. Well, not home, but he goes back to Bethany to stay with friends. Now, the next day, verse 15, he's going to come into the temple and he's going to drive out the money changers, and he's going to make a whip out of cords, and he's going to turn over the tables, and so on. Now, this also is sometimes understood as Jesus flipping out, as Jesus just kind of losing his rag. Now, there's no way that this is what Mark is wanting to say to us about what Jesus does, because if he was going to lose his rag, he would have lost it that Sunday night when he went and looked around the temple. That's when he looks around, he sees it all, and he goes out again. The next day he comes in and he does what is another prophetic action. He comes in, he turns over the tables, he releases the animals, and incidentally, N.T. Wright says that one of the things that's happening here is Jesus is interrupting temple sacrifice, because what he's interrupting is he's interrupting the apparatus of buying and selling animals which are going to be sacrificed. And so for half an hour or something, temple sacrifice is completely brought to a standstill. And that this is a prophetic action about the fact that the temple is becoming redundant, and at the cross the temple becomes redundant because now Jesus has done the work that the temple used to do. But that this is demonstrated in prophetic action at this moment. And I think that's one of the things that's happening here. But the other thing, and I think Mark is highlighting this to us, is that is connected with this theme that I've mentioned a few times, this Old Testament theme of God will visit his temple. And again in the prophets we see this language of God will visit, and he will check to see if you are fruitful. He will visit and he will judge the temple. We see it again and again, and I think, well, in fact, I'm sure that that is what is going on here. So let me just highlight this to you. In narrative terms, we have Jesus going in, checking it out, going home, coming back the next day, and judging it in this very public demonstration, this very public action of judging the temple, which they should have recognised as being a prophetic action and should have been puzzling about what that might have been pointing to. But around that action of Jesus clearing the temple, we have the fig tree, because there's a second half of the fig tree story in Mark's Gospel. So in the way that the Gospel is structured, this is what we have. Jesus is coming back into Jerusalem on the Monday, and he sees this fig tree. Now he knows it's not fig season. He's a country lad. He knows, he's deeply familiar with agriculture. There's no way he thinks there's real fruit on this tree. I understand that a fig tree has a kind of a false fruit early on in its cycle, when it's got these kind of buds that look like fruit and they're not, they're leaf buds. I think there's something, I'm slightly vague about the details of that. But anyway, so he sees this fig tree and he walks up to it. And this is another public action. So he says, oh, look, there's a fig tree. Let me see if there is fruit on that fig tree. Now that should have been making people's ears prick up, because this is Old Testament prophet language. Again and again, we've seen this exact sort of language. So he walks up to the fig tree. Oh, there is no fruit on this fig tree. May you never bear fruit again. Okay, so this is a very public action, and it is supposed to remind the people of those Old Testament prophecies that are about God calling for fruit and being disappointed with lack of fruit. Then he walks into the temple. He does this second symbolic action of the day, the cleansing of the temple. And then, to make sure we don't miss the point, Mark then takes us back to the fig tree. So they're coming back out again in the afternoon, or in the morning, in fact. And they see that the fig tree is now withered. He has brought the temple to a standstill. He walks out, and there is the fig tree withered. So Mark is setting up this great kind of flashing neon sign over what is going on, and saying, look at what is going on. Understand the significance of this action. Jesus is not flipping out with either the fig tree or with the temple. This is a very deliberate public demonstration of the judgment of God. That was the first thing I wanted to show you. The second thing I want to show you is turning back to Mark chapter 2, I think. Just find it a second. Mark chapter 1, verse 21. I'm just going to read this to you, actually, these few verses first. They went into Capernaum. This is the first miracle in, let me just double check that. Yeah, it's the first miracle in Mark's Gospel. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, as that word again, and not as the scribes. And immediately, there's that word again, there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. Okay, so just a couple of comments about this. This is Jesus' first action after he's called the 4 disciples. He strides into the synagogue in Capernaum, and immediately he is met with opposition. Now, in many times in the Gospels, Jesus is met with opposition, and very often this is, grumbling scribes and critical Pharisees and the religious leaders and so on. And that's going to happen. But here, he immediately meets with opposition, and it's a demon. Now, this should bother us because he hasn't met this demon among the tombs. He's going to meet a demon among the tombs later on. But here he has met a demon in the synagogue. This is a place that should be a bastion for the forces of light. And he's walked in, and immediately he's met a demon. And we need to notice the demon's words, because what does the demon say? He says, "What have you come here for, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." What does that mean? Have you come to destroy us? He walks into the synagogue, he encounters a demon, and the demon says, "Have you come to destroy us?" And I think this demon sounds like the forces of vested interest and status quo. There is something powerful and rotten at the heart of this synagogue, something that is sensing the move of God, and smells the change in the wind and is resisting it. And here in his hometown of Capernaum, it's quite an urbane city. It's at the heart of that city. Jesus experiences the very first power confrontation of his ministry, at least as Mark narrates the story. And he's come up against the powers of darkness, which identify him without doubt as being God's man, and they protest that. And they are only cast down from their strongholds with convulsions and shrieking when he speaks the word of authority. I think it is more than coincidence that Jesus met a demon that day. And I think it is inevitable, actually, because if we believe the traditional authorship of the letters of John, then one of the witnesses who was there in the synagogue that day later wrote these words: "This is the reason the Son of God was revealed, to destroy the works and of the evil one." And I don't know whether John wrote John's letters or not. That's something we might discuss when we get there in a couple of weeks. But the point is this, that this is the inevitable consequence of the appearing of the Son of God, is that it will meet with confrontation. There will be a spiritual confrontation happens, and we see that immediately. And I think it's more than coincidence that this is the first act of power that Mark records in his gospel. This is another symbolic action. Remember what he said, what his opening words, "The time is fulfilled." Do you remember that Old Testament language of the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord? Here is God's day of decisive action. It has arrived, and it is attested to with authority over the powers of darkness. I think that's really exciting, as you can probably guess. The powers of darkness cannot coexist with Jesus, and all rulers and their kingdoms, great ones and petty ones, must bow the knee to Jesus, and Mark shows us that right at the very beginning. Have I got time for one more thing to show you? Well, you can always switch off if you think I haven't, but I'm going to show you one more thing in this gospel because it's just such a wonderful gospel. Mark 13, and I'm going to pull out some ideas here, which so much of what I'm showing you is not my own work, and that vested interest stuff actually is my own thinking on it. But I stand on the shoulders of giants all the time in these videos. I'm consulting commentaries and listening to other people and so on, and just presenting you little bits of other people's hard work, really. So here I am giving you some of the ideas of my friend and colleague Stephen Finnemore, who has studied this chapter Mark 13 in a lot of detail. In Mark 13, this is we get now. Do you remember when I spoke about the prophets first? And I think that was probably when we came to the beginning of Isaiah, I'm guessing. I spoke about prophetic foreshortening. I spoke about the mountain range, where it looks as if those peaks are right on top of one another, but actually if you look sideways on, they are a long way apart. And I think we have prophetic foreshortening here, because in Mark 13 we have language concerning the destruction of the temple, which, as I said, was going to take place in AD 70. We also have language concerning the end of days. And throughout, we have language that hints about the coming crucifixion of Jesus. So this is kind of how I think it plays out in brief. The first 8 verses, what are the signs of this, of the imminent fulfillment of these promises? The disciples come and ask him. Is kind of preamble to the chapter, and it seems to contain references to both the temple destruction and the end of days. Then in verses 9 to 23, we get what is probably a discourse that is predominantly about the destruction of the physical temple in AD 70. He says things like, let those who are in, this is verse 14, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Verse 17, alas for women who are pregnant in those days. Pray it may not happen in winter. So he's talking about an imminent event, which is the fall of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem under the Romans in AD 70. Then in verses 24 to 36, which then is introduced by these words, in those days. Remember this prophetic language that we've seen so many times in the Old Testament. Then he seems to be talking about the eschaton, about the end of times. The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. We saw that is end of the world language. The stars will be falling from heaven and the powers in the heavens will be shaken, and the Son of Man coming in clouds. These are ideas that we are already familiar with from the prophets, referring to the end of times. So we are seeing something about the destruction of the temple, something about the end of the world. But woven through it, we have references that seem to hint towards the cross. So Jesus speaks about being handed over, flogged, standing before governor and king, trial, betrayal, about false testimony, about an earthquake, about an abomination that causes desolation. What could be more abominable than the crucifixion of God's own Son? Speaks about fleeing without a coat, which we read of happening in Mark's Gospel in the Garden of Gethsemane. He speaks of the darkening of the sun, speaks about a lesson from a fig tree, speaks about a gospel being preached to all nations, and we see the centurion's acclamation at the cross. Speaks about keeping watch, speaks about the cock crowing, speaks about the Son of Man coming. Now that is all, although it is woven through this discourse about the destruction of the temple and about the end of times, it also seems in many ways to point to the crucifixion account as well. So if my colleague Steve is correct, and I think he is, then what we have going on here is we have the destruction of 3 temples at once. Now we have spoken about the fact that Garden of Eden, which is, and I've kind of touched on it, but I haven't fleshed it out as much as I'd like. The Garden of Eden, which is the cosmic temple. So in other words, the heavens and earth are the temple of God. This is well understood. We see the image in the creation account in Genesis 1, and we see the image in the Psalms, and it's clearly understood by commentators on the Old Testament. The heavens and the earth are the temple of God, and they are going to be destroyed. We see that in Mark 13. We see the physical temple being destroyed in Mark 13. And we also bearing in mind that the Gospels tell us Jesus says, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. So he himself clearly refers to himself as the temple. So woven through it then, we also have this account of the destruction of the temple that is Jesus's own body. So these 3 temples, the heavens and the earth, the physical temple, and Jesus's own body, are all described as coming to an end in this chapter. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because the great theme of temple, which is the place where people and God meet, the place where God speaks to his people, where God guides his people, and the place where forgiveness is obtained. The great theme of temple, which is seen in the cosmos, represented in the physical temple, is most truly encapsulated in the body of Jesus Christ. And so when he dies on the cross, and as he dies, and the temple, the curtain of the temple is torn open, and we talk about that quite often in terms of the Holy of Holies being laid bare for people to enter, and that is true. But this is a demonstration by God of the destruction of the temple, the physical temple, which represents the true temple, who is Jesus Christ's own body, because this is the place where God is encountered, where forgiveness is obtained, where the word of God is spoken. And that is all being kind of shown in this wonderful but slightly mysterious chapter of Mark 13. I love Mark's Gospel, as you may have picked up. Tomorrow I'm going to show you how much I love Luke's Gospel. I'll see you then, I hope.